The security footage looked like something out of a nature documentary gone completely sideways. There was Dr. Mira Wells, all 5 feet 4 inches of unassuming human, strolling through the Galactic Research Station's most dangerous wildlife preserve like she was walking through a botanical garden. Behind her, in a neat single file that would make a kindergarten teacher weep with joy, 6 umbral hunter cubs padded along with the devotion of freshly imprinted ducklings. Each cub was roughly the size of an earth tiger, covered in midnight black fur that seemed to absorb light, with crystalline claws that could shred through titanium plating, and teeth designed by evolution's most sadistic engineer. They followed Mira with their massive heads tilted slightly upward, watching her every movement with an intensity that suggested they'd throw themselves into a black hole if she asked nicely. Station Commander Thalo paused the footage with one scaled claw, his reptilian features twisted into what his species considered deep contemplation, but looked more like severe indigestion to human eyes. His throat sac inflated twice, a sure sign that someone was about to get a lecture on proper protocol and the inherent dangers of treating apex predators like house pets. "Explain this to me, Finn," Thalo said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from commanding a space station filled with the galaxy's most dangerous fauna. "Explain to me why a human researcher is taking a casual afternoon stroll with 6 specimens that have hospitalized 12 of our best xenobiologists in the past rotation cycle alone." Security Chief Finn pulled up the incident reports on his holographic display, the blue light casting shadows across his weathered face. He'd been working security in the Outer Rim for 23 standard years, had seen pirates try to steal sentient crystals, watched smugglers attempt to traffic telepathic parasites, and once helped contain a breach involving carnivorous plants that sang lullabies to their prey. But this situation had him scratching his head harder than a Rigelian flea infestation. "According to the logs, sir, Dr. Wells has been unconventional in her approach," Finn said, choosing his words carefully. "When you worked with 17 different species, each with their own concepts of offense and propriety, diplomatic language became second nature. She's been working with these particular specimens for the past 3 months. 3 months, Thalo repeated, his throat sac deflating slightly. And in those 3 months, she's managed to achieve what our entire xenobiology department couldn't accomplish in 2 standard years of study." The footage resumed, showing Mira pausing to examine something on the ground. The cubs immediately stopped, forming a protective semicircle around her while she knelt to collect a sample. One of the younger cubs, identifiable by a distinctive scar across its left shoulder, actually stepped closer and lowered its massive head to sniff at whatever had caught her attention. "The umbral hunters are from Nethys Prime," Finn continued, reading from the species database. "Apex predators, pack intelligence, emotional complexity comparable to higher mammals. Native environment includes atmospheric pressure that would crush a human in approximately 4 seconds. I'm familiar with the species profile," Thale interrupted, though not unkindly. "What I'm not familiar with is how a human managed to gain their trust when our most experienced researchers can barely approach them without full environmental suits and neural inhibitor fields." Finn switched to another camera angle, this one showing Mira from 3 months earlier on her first day aboard the station. She looked exactly the same. Shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, standard-issue research jumpsuit that hung loose on her small frame, and an expression of intense curiosity that seemed permanently etched on her features. The only difference was the complete absence of massive predators treating her like their long-lost pack leader. The memory files showed her initial briefing with the xenobiology team. Grixon, the station's senior researcher, had been particularly vocal about the humans' assignment to what they euphemistically called the challenging specimens section. "With all due respect to our human colleagues," Grixon had said, his forearms gesturing in a pattern that conveyed polite skepticism in his species' body language, "the umbral hunter cubs have proven difficult. Perhaps Dr. Wells would be better suited to cataloging the crystalline formations in Section 9, much less likely to result in casualties." Mira had smiled at that, the kind of smile that suggested she'd heard variations of this speech before. "I appreciate the concern, but I specialize in traumatized juveniles. These cubs lost their mother to poachers, correct? They're not aggressive. They're grieving." The silence that followed had been the kind you could cut with a plasma torch. Grief, as a concept, was not widely recognized among the galactic scientific community. Most species viewed emotional responses as primitive evolutionary holdovers, inefficiencies to be catalogued and dismissed rather than understood and addressed. "Grieving," Grixon had repeated, his translator struggling with the concept. "You're suggesting these apex predators are experiencing emotional distress." "I'm suggesting these cubs watched their mother die violently, were separated from their pack structure, transported across space in sterile containment units, and are now being poked and prodded by strangers who smell like fear and antiseptic," Mira had replied with the patience of someone explaining water to a fish. "So, yes, I'd say emotional distress covers it pretty well." Back in the present, Thyla watched the security footage with growing fascination as Mira led her unusual parade toward the research laboratories. The cubs moved with a fluid grace that spoke of complete trust. No hesitation, no wariness, just absolute faith that the small human walking ahead of them knew exactly where she was going and why. "Show me her first contact with the specimens," Thale ordered. Finn pulled up files from 3 months prior, switching to the internal cameras of Containment Unit 12. The cubs had been a pitiful sight back then. 6 bundles of matted fur huddled together in the far corner of their enclosure, refusing food, refusing interaction, refusing everything except the basic biological imperatives that kept them technically alive. The standard protocol called for environmental suits, neural dampening fields, and at least 3 armed guards whenever anyone entered their containment area. The cubs had already demonstrated their ability to move faster than most species could track, and their claws could slice through standard protective gear like it was decorative paper. Mira had walked in wearing nothing but her research jumpsuit and a small pack of what looked suspiciously like her personal lunch rations. "No environmental suit," Thale observed. "No neural dampeners?" Finn added. "No backup. Not even a comm unit." They watched in fascination as past Mira approached the huddled cubs slowly, making no sudden movements, her hands visible and empty. She'd stopped about 10 feet away and simply sat down on the floor, cross-legged, and opened her pack. For 2 hours, she just sat there, eating her sandwich, occasionally making quiet observations into her personal recorder, completely ignoring the 6 apex predators that could have turned her into human confetti faster than the security systems could respond. "The cubs didn't move for the first hour and 53 minutes, Finn noted, checking the timestamps. Then the scarred one, the smallest, started watching her. On screen, the cub in question had indeed begun to show interest. Its head lifted slightly, nostrils flaring as it caught Mira's scent. Unlike the fear-tinged chemical signatures of the other researchers, Mira's scent carried something different. Something that didn't trigger every predatory instinct evolution had hardwired into umbral hunter neurology. "She smells wrong," Thyle realized. "Not wrong," Finn corrected, pulling up the atmospheric analysis from that day. She smells calm. No stress hormones, no adrenaline spike, no fight or flight response. According to the bioscanners, her heart rate was actually lower than her baseline. Mira had finished her sandwich and pulled out what appeared to be an apple. Instead of eating it, she'd rolled it gently across the floor toward the cubs, not close enough to seem threatening, but close enough that they couldn't miss the gesture. Then she'd waited. The scarred cub had been the first to approach, belly low to the ground, every muscle coiled for instant retreat. It had sniffed the apple thoroughly, glanced at Mira, then very carefully picked up the fruit and carried it back to the pack. Within minutes, all 6 cubs were sharing the apple, their first voluntary food consumption since arriving at the station. "Remarkable," Thale murmured. "Gets better," Finn said, fast-forwarding through the next several weeks of footage. "Watch this." The time-lapse showed Mira's daily visits to the cubs' containment unit. Each day she stayed a little longer, moved a little closer, brought different foods and simple toys. The cubs' transformation was gradual but undeniable. From traumatized survivors barely clinging to life to curious juveniles beginning to explore their environment. She never tried to touch them, Finn pointed out. Never pushed boundaries, never forced interaction, just was there, consistently, predictably, safely there. By week 6, the cubs were greeting her arrival with what could only be described as enthusiasm. By week 8, they were following her around their enclosure like she was their missing pack leader. By week 10, the containment protocols had been completely rewritten because the cubs would only cooperate with research procedures if Mira was present. "And now?" Thale asked. Finn switched back to the current footage, showing Mira and her 6-member entourage entering the main research laboratory. Other researchers scattered like startled birds, clearing a path that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with self-preservation instincts that transcended species barriers. "Now they won't let her out of their sight," Finn said. "Environmental scans show they're constantly monitoring her vital signs, her location, her emotional state. If she's upset about something, they get agitated. If she's happy, they're content. If she's in potential danger." He pulled up an incident report from the previous week when a malfunctioning gravity generator had caused several heavy pieces of equipment to fall near Mira's workstation. The cubs had moved as a coordinated unit, forming a protective barrier around her before the debris had even finished falling. "They're not following her," Thale realized, watching the footage with new understanding. "They're guarding her." "That's the working theory," Finn agreed. "Doctor." Wells seems to think it's more complicated than that, though. Something about pack dynamics and trust hierarchies that, I'll be honest, sir, goes right over my head. Thale studied the screen, where Mira was now preparing some kind of nutritional supplement, while the cubs arranged themselves in a perfect defensive formation around her workstation. Their positioning wasn't random. It was tactical, covering all possible approaches while maintaining clear lines of sight and communication with each other. These specimens were scheduled for memory modification and behavioral conditioning, Thale said quietly. "Yes, sir. Standard protocol for uncooperative research subjects. And instead, we have a human who's accomplished more in 3 months than our xenobiology department managed in 2 years. "Yes, sir." Thale's throat sac inflated again, but this time it was thoughtfulness rather than irritation. In his 43 years of service, he'd learned to recognize paradigm shifts when they happened. This felt like one of those moments when everything you thought you knew about a subject suddenly required complete reevaluation. "Schedule a meeting with Dr. Wells," he decided. I want to understand exactly how she's achieved this level of interspecies cooperation. Should I mention that the cubs will probably insist on attending the meeting? Thele looked at the screen again, where 6 apex predators were now arranged in a formation that would make any military strategist proud, all focused on protecting one small human who was completely oblivious to her status as the galaxy's most unlikely pack leader. At this point, Finn, he said, with something that might have been amusement, I think we should assume the cubs will be attending everything. The meeting took place in Conference Room Delta, which had been hastily reconfigured to accommodate 6 apex predators who apparently considered themselves part of the research team. Thela had initially suggested sedating the cubs for everyone's safety, a proposal that Mira had declined with the kind of diplomatic firmness usually reserved for refusing offers of expired rations. They're not dangerous when they're with me, she'd explained, as if discussing the weather rather than creatures that could disembowel a Krellian battle mech without breaking stride. Sedation would only convince them that you see them as threats rather than individuals. So now Thele found himself sharing a conference table with what was arguably the most unusual research team in galactic history. Mira sat at one end, perfectly at ease, while the cubs had arranged themselves around the room's perimeter like living shadows. The scarred one, whom Mira had taken to calling Scout, though she was careful never to use the name in official reports, had positioned itself directly behind her chair, close enough that its breathing ruffled her hair. Your methods are... Grixon paused, all 4 arms gesturing as his translator struggled to find appropriate terms. Unprecedented. Our xenobiology protocols have been refined over centuries of interspecies research. Your protocols assume that emotional intelligence is a primitive trait, Mira replied without heat. That higher intelligence automatically means abandoning feelings in favor of pure logic. It's a reasonable assumption, if you've never actually worked with traumatized juveniles. Zephia, the station's medical officer, leaned forward with interest. Her species had evolved from hive-minded insects, which made her perspective on individual emotional responses particularly fascinating to observe. You're suggesting that these cubs possess individual psychological profiles distinct from their base species programming? I'm suggesting that grief is a survival mechanism, not a bug in the system, Mira said. These cubs didn't just lose their mother. They lost their primary source of safety, education, and social structure. In human psychology, we'd call it complex trauma. The symptoms are textbook: withdrawal, hypervigilance, inability to form new attachments, refusal of basic care. Thale's neck scales rippled with what passed for skepticism in his species. And yet, they've formed an attachment to you. Because I didn't try to force one, Mira explained, glancing back at Scout, who immediately perked up at the attention. Traditional xenobiology approaches these situations like engineering problems. Identify the malfunction, apply the appropriate fix, measure the results. But emotional healing doesn't work that way. Trust has to be earned, not programmed. Grixon pulled up a holographic display, showing brain scans of the cubs from their first week in captivity versus their current state. The difference was startling. Areas associated with stress response had normalized, while regions linked to social bonding showed unprecedented activity levels. The neurochemical changes are undeniable, he admitted grudgingly, but correlation doesn't establish causation. Perhaps these specimens were simply adjusting to their new environment. Then why didn't they respond to anyone else? Mira asked. Your team tried the same environmental modifications, the same nutritional supplements, the same environmental enrichments. The cubs remained unresponsive until you arrived, Thale finished. Until someone arrived who wasn't afraid of them, Mira corrected. Fear has a scent, you know. Adrenaline, stress hormones, the physiological markers of fight-or-flight response. To a predator species, those chemical signatures mean one of two things: prey or threat. Neither category inspires trust. She stood and walked to the far wall, where a holographic star map showed the cub's home system. As she moved, Scout's head tracked her motion with laser focus, while the other 5 cubs shifted position to maintain their protective formation. The umbral hunters evolved on a world where cooperation meant survival, Mira continued. Pack bonds aren't just social structures, they're neurochemical imperatives. When the cub's mother was killed, they didn't just lose a parent. They lost their entire understanding of how the universe works. Zephia's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. And you provided a new framework for understanding. I provided consistency, Mira said. Same time every day, same calm emotional state, same respectful distance. No demands, no invasive procedures, no attempts to establish dominance, just presence. The holographic display shifted to show surveillance footage from Mira's early visits. Even now, weeks later, Thaley found the images unsettling. Watching someone sit motionless for hours in the presence of apex predators violated every survival instinct evolution had programmed into sentient life. Other researchers attempted to replicate your methods, Grixon pointed out. The results were unsuccessful. That was putting it diplomatically. 3 separate teams had tried to apply Mira's patience protocol with disastrous results. 2 researchers had required emergency medical treatment, and 1 had flat-out refused to enter the cub's containment area after what he'd described as the most terrifying staring contest in galactic history. Because they were performing patience rather than feeling it, Mira explained. The cubs can sense emotional authenticity through pheromonal analysis. They know the difference between someone who's genuinely calm and someone who's suppressing panic behind professional composure. She returned to her seat, and Scout immediately relaxed, settling back into what appeared to be a meditative state. The other cubs followed suit, creating an atmosphere of watchful tranquility that was both impressive and slightly unnerving. Your species has an unusual neurochemical profile, Zephia observed, studying her medical scanner's readings. Lower baseline cortisol levels, higher oxytocin production, enhanced mirror neuron activity. It's almost as if humans evolved specifically for interspecies empathy. Maybe we did, Mira said, with a slight smile. Earth was a pretty diverse place. Learning to read and respond to hundreds of different species' emotional states would have been a significant survival advantage. Thaley's throat sac inflated slowly as he processed this information. You're proposing that human emotional intelligence represents an evolutionary specialization rather than a primitive holdover. I'm proposing that intelligence isn't just about processing information, Mira replied. It's about building relationships, creating trust, understanding needs that can't always be expressed in words. The cubs don't follow me because I'm clever. They follow me because they believe I'll protect them. As if to demonstrate the point, Scout's head suddenly snapped toward the conference room's entrance, followed immediately by the other 5 cubs. A low, rumbling sound filled the room, not quite a growl, but something that made Thale's combat instincts start screaming warnings about immediate and lethal danger. Motion sensors detect 3 individuals approaching, Nexus announced in its perfectly modulated artificial voice. Species identification, Vakaran. Estimated arrival, 30 seconds. The Vakarans were a militaristic species known for their efficiency and their complete lack of what humans called bedside manner. They also happened to be the original contractors for the cubs' capture and transport, a detail that apparently wasn't lost on 6 young predators, whose mothers had died at Vakaran hands. Mira was on her feet instantly, not running toward the exit, but stepping between the cubs and the door. Her posture was completely calm, but Thale noticed that her hand movements had become more deliberate, more visible, universal soothing gestures that transcended species barriers. "It's okay," she said quietly, addressing the cubs rather than the room's other occupants. "Different people, different situation. You're safe." The rumbling sound faded, but the cubs remained alert, arranged in what was unmistakably a defensive formation. Scout had moved to Mira's left side, positioning himself to intercept any threat to her flank, while the others created overlapping fields of coverage that would make a military tactician weep with professional admiration. "Remarkable," Zephyr breathed. "They're not just protecting her, they're coordinating their protection based on tactical assessment of potential threats." The Vakarans entered without ceremony, their scaled hides gleaming under the conference room's artificial lighting. They moved with the mechanical precision of a species that had evolved warfare into an art form, their multifaceted eyes taking in the room's unusual occupants with the kind of calculating attention that predators recognized on a genetic level. "Commander Thale," the lead Vakaran said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from a lifetime of giving orders that weren't questioned. "We've come to discuss the specimen's conditioning schedule. Our buyers are becoming impatient." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The cubs' rumbling resumed, deeper now, harmonizing in a way that made the conference room's reinforced walls seem suddenly insufficient. Scout's muscles coiled with barely restrained violence, waiting for some signal from Mira that never came. Instead, she remained perfectly still, radiating the kind of calm that could only come from someone who understood exactly how dangerous the situation had become, and had decided that fear wasn't going to solve anything. "The cubs aren't going anywhere," she said quietly. The lead Vakaran's attention shifted to her with the kind of focus that usually preceded something unpleasant. "You are the human researcher. Your involvement with these specimens has been noted." "My involvement," Mira replied with the patience of someone explaining orbital mechanics to a child, "has been the first successful integration of umbral hunter juveniles into a research environment. The cubs are no longer specimens, they're colleagues." The silence that followed was the kind that usually preceded either breakthrough scientific discoveries or spectacular diplomatic incidents. Thale found himself calculating the odds of containing 6 enraged apex predators in a standard conference room while simultaneously wondering if the station's insurance policies covered interspecies diplomatic catastrophe. The lead Vakaran clicked his mandibles once, a sound that his species used to indicate either mild amusement or immediate lethal intent. Given the circumstances, Thala really hoped it was the former. "Colleagues," the Vakaran repeated slowly. "You believe these predators consider you their equal?" Mira's smile was the kind that could have powered a small space station. "I believe these individuals consider me their family. And family doesn't abandon each other for profit." Behind her, 6 apex predators settled into perfect stillness, waiting to see whether diplomacy or violence would be required to protect the small human who had somehow convinced them that the universe might still be a place where trust was possible. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if the station's emergency klaxons hadn't chosen that exact moment to start screaming like banshees with amplification systems. The conference room's lights shifted to emergency amber, and Nexus's voice cut through the chaos with the kind of artificial calm that only made everything seem more terrifying. Station-wide security breach detected. Multiple unauthorized vessels have docked at ports 12 through 18. All personnel report to designated emergency stations immediately. Thyla was already moving toward the command console, his scaled fingers dancing across controls with practiced efficiency. The main display flickered to life, showing the station's external cameras picking up half a dozen ships that definitely weren't on any approved visitor registry. These weren't the sleek diplomatic vessels or utilitarian research transports that usually graced their docking bays. These were Predator-class assault ships, bristling with the kind of weaponry that existed solely to make other ships stop existing. "Poachers," the lead Vakaran said, and for the first time since entering the room, his voice carried something other than cold authority. There was recognition there, and what might have been concern if Vakarans were capable of such emotions. The same syndicate that harvested the umbral hunters from Nethys Prime. The Cubs' reaction was immediate and visceral. The low rumbling that had been simmering beneath their calm exterior erupted into something that bypassed the ear and went straight to the primitive brainstem, triggering every flight response evolution had ever programmed into sentient life. 6 apex predators recognized the scent of their mother's killers, and their emotional state could be summarized as apocalyptically homicidal. "They remember," Mira said, her voice cutting through the Cubs' harmonized fury with supernatural clarity. She hadn't moved from her position between them and the door, but her posture had shifted subtly. No longer the calm researcher explaining pack dynamics, but something harder, more protective. "They know these ships." Finn's voice crackled through the comm system, competing with the emergency klaxons for audio supremacy. "Commander, we've got armed intruders breaching sections 9 through 15. They're heading for the preserve levels with military-grade containment equipment. This isn't a raid, it's a harvest operation." Thale's neck scales rippled with what his species called combative determination, but looked more like barely controlled rage to human eyes. "Security teams, implement lockdown protocols immediately. All research personnel to emergency shelters." "The Cubs can't go to the shelters," Mira said, her statement cutting through the chaos like a plasma torch through tissue paper. "They'll fight anyone who tries to separate us, and the shelters can't contain them if they panic." "Dr. Wells," Thale began, his tone carrying the kind of authority that had maintained order on a research station filled with the galaxy's most dangerous fauna. "This is not a negotiation. Those poachers have technology specifically designed to capture and transport apex predators. Your safety is irrelevant if the Cubs are captured," Mira interrupted, with the kind of calm that only came from someone who had already made their peace with terrible decisions. "They survived losing their mother once. They won't survive it again." Scout had moved closer, pressing against Mira's left side with enough force to remind everyone present that cub was a relative term when discussing creatures that could bench press a hover tank. The other 5 had arranged themselves in formation, creating a defensive perimeter that would have made a military academy instructor weep with professional pride. "The preserve levels have been compromised," Finn's voice reported, barely audible over the sound of plasma fire and what might have been screaming. "Poachers are using neural dampening fields and sonic disruptors. Most of the specimens are down." Mira's expression shifted, and for the first time since the crisis began, Thale saw something in her eyes that made his combat instincts start recalculating threat assessments. It wasn't fear. Fear would have been understandable, even rational. This was something colder, more focused. This was a predator recognizing that negotiation time was over. "Nexus," she said, her voice carrying a new edge that made Scout's ears perk up with interest. "Can you override the containment protocols for all preserve levels?" That action would require authorization from, "Can you do it?" "Yes." "Then do it." Thales' throat sac inflated with what might have been shock. "Doctor, Wells, releasing every dangerous specimen on the station is exactly what we need to do," Mira finished, turning to face the room with an expression that suggested she'd been thinking several moves ahead, while everyone else was still trying to understand the current situation. These poachers came prepared to handle contained, sedated specimens. They're not prepared to handle a coordinated defensive response from creatures that consider this station home. The lead Vakaran's mandibles clicked once, twice, the equivalent of thoughtful consideration. "You're proposing to use the preserved specimens as combatants." "I'm proposing to give them the choice," Mira corrected. "Most of these creatures have been traumatized by capture, transport, and confinement. They know the difference between people who want to study them and people who want to exploit them." Through the conference room's reinforced windows, they could see the corridor beyond filling with chaos. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish amber, while the sound of approaching combat grew steadily louder. The poachers were moving with the kind of systematic efficiency that spoke of extensive planning and intimate knowledge of the station's layout. "They're coming this way," Zephyr observed, her medical scanner detecting multiple life signs advancing through the station's maze of research levels. "Estimated arrival: 3 minutes." Mira knelt beside Scout, placing one hand on the massive cub's shoulder, with the kind of casual intimacy that still made Thales' species memory scream warnings about humans and their inexplicable ability to form bonds with apex predators. "What do you think, friend?" Ready to remind some people why umbral hunters are considered apex predators. Scout's response was a sound that bypassed language entirely and went straight to the part of the brain responsible for recognizing imminent and spectacular violence. The other cubs joined in, creating a harmonic frequency that made the conference room's walls vibrate with sympathetic resonance. "Nexus," Thales said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would either save the station or doom everyone aboard. "Override all containment protocols. Release everything." "Acknowledged. Containment protocols disabled. All specimen restraints deactivated." The immediate results were audible throughout the station. Emergency klaxons were joined by the sounds of creatures that had been confined, studied, and catalogued, suddenly finding themselves free to express their opinions about the experience. The symphony of liberation was both terrifying and oddly beautiful, a cacophony of roars, calls, and sonic frequencies that represented dozens of worlds' worth of evolutionary development suddenly unleashed in a common cause. "The specimens are responding to the release," Finn reported, his voice tight with what might have been awe. "But instead of scattering, they're organizing, moving toward the poacher incursion points in coordinated groups." "They're following the cub's lead," Mira explained, standing as Scout and his siblings moved toward the conference room's exit with purposeful determination. "Pack behavior is contagious among intelligent species. One group demonstrates coordinated response, others recognize the tactical advantage and adapt accordingly." The conference room's doors opened, revealing a corridor that had transformed from sterile research facility to something resembling a nature preserve designed by strategic warfare specialists. Creatures that had been separated by containment protocols for months or years were moving together with the kind of fluid coordination that suggested they'd been practicing formation tactics in their spare time. A pack of crystalline serpents from the Andromedas sector had wrapped themselves around a family of armored herbivores from Kepler Prime, creating a mobile fortress bristling with natural weapons and defensive capabilities. Overhead, aerial predators from half a dozen worlds flew in formation, their various species differences forgotten in favor of tactical superiority. "Remarkable," Gregson breathed, his forearms gesturing frantically as he tried to record everything his instruments could detect. Interspecies cooperation on this scale has never been documented outside of symbiotic relationships. Mira stepped into the corridor, and the assembled creatures parted like water, creating a clear path while maintaining their defensive formations. The cubs took point, with Scout leading the way toward the sounds of combat with the kind of focused determination that made Thale suddenly very grateful that humans had evolved as cooperative rather than competitive species. They're not just following her, Zephyr realized, watching her scanner track the biometric data of dozens of species moving in perfect harmony. They're protecting her, all of them. Because she protected them first, Thale said, understanding finally clicking into place like the final piece of a puzzle he hadn't realized he'd been solving. When the containment systems failed, when the neural dampeners were activated, when the research protocols became invasive, she was the one who said no. The sound of plasma fire was getting closer, accompanied by shouts in several languages and the distinctive whine of containment technology being pushed beyond operational parameters. The poachers had clearly not expected resistance from creatures they'd assumed would be sedated and helpless. "Finn," Thale said into his comm unit, "what's the status on the incursion?" "Changing rapidly, sir," came the reply, accompanied by what sounded like a sonic boom and something that might have been screaming. "The poachers are encountering significantly more resistance than anticipated. Their containment technology seems to be insufficient for the current situation." Through the corridor's transparency panels, they could see flashes of bioluminescent communication, the universal signals that evolved predators used to coordinate attacks across species barriers. The creatures weren't just fighting back. They were hunting. Mira paused at a junction in the corridor, looking back at the conference room where Thale, Gregson, and Zephyr stood watching the most unusual tactical deployment in galactic history. Her expression was calm, almost serene, despite the chaos surrounding them. "The cubs don't follow anyone they don't trust," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the sounds of combat. "But trust is just the beginning. What they're really following is the promise that someone will fight for them when fighting becomes necessary." Scout appeared at her shoulder, his scarred face turned toward the approaching sounds of battle, with an expression that suggested the poacher's day was about to become significantly worse. Behind him, his siblings arranged themselves in formation, while dozens of other species prepared to demonstrate why evolution had made them apex predators on their respective worlds. "Time to keep that promise," Mira said, and led her unlikely army toward a confrontation that would either redefine interspecies cooperation or result in the most spectacular tactical disaster in recorded galactic history. Thale found himself hoping it would be the former, while preparing for the possibility that it might be both. The battle lasted exactly 19 minutes and 36 seconds, according to Nexus's precise timing systems. It would have lasted longer if the poachers had been prepared for what amounted to a coordinated insurgency led by a 5'4" human xenobiologist and her self-appointed army of interspecies allies. The poachers' sonic disruptors, designed to incapacitate individual specimens, proved woefully inadequate against creatures that had learned to harmonize their vocalizations for maximum psychological impact. Their neural dampening fields, calibrated for panicked and isolated subjects, failed completely when faced with predators operating in coordinated pack formations that distributed tactical decisions across multiple neural networks. Most importantly, their containment technology had been designed with the assumption that captured creatures would be weakened by fear and isolation. They had not anticipated specimens that fought with the kind of focused determination that came from protecting something they valued more than their own survival. Scout had been the first to reach the poacher's main force, leading his siblings in a flanking maneuver that would have impressed military strategists across 3 sectors. The crystalline serpents provided mobile cover, while the armored herbivores created choke points that funneled the intruders into perfect ambush positions. Overhead, the aerial predators conducted reconnaissance and coordinated strikes, with the precision of a species that had evolved warfare into an art form. Mira had stayed in the center of the formation, not because she needed protection, but because her presence allowed the various species to maintain their unprecedented cooperation. She was the common denominator, the shared reference point that allowed creatures from dozens of different worlds to function as a single tactical unit. The end came when the lead poacher, realizing that his carefully planned harvest operation had become a one-sided massacre, attempted to retreat to his ship with what few specimens his team had managed to capture. He found his path blocked by 6 umbral hunter cubs, who had apparently taken the phrase "no one left behind" very seriously indeed. Scout's final pounce was a thing of beauty, pure, predatory. Efficiency combined with what could only be described as personal satisfaction. The poacher's containment suit, designed to protect against claws and teeth, proved utterly inadequate against an apex predator who had learned that some fights were worth winning, regardless of the cost. The aftermath found Thala standing in what used to be his pristine research station, surveying damage that looked like it had been caused by a small war, which, in fairness, it had been. Scorch marks decorated the walls, several bulkheads would need complete replacement, and there was something that might have been poacher remains decorating the ceiling of Section 12. "Casualty report," he requested, dreading the answer. "0 fatalities among station personnel," Finn reported, sounding faintly surprised by his own words. "Minimal injuries, mostly bruises, and minor lacerations from people diving for cover. The specimens, well, they're all accounted for and in excellent health. And the poachers? Those that survived have been placed in temporary containment pending pickup by Galactic Authority enforcement. The others—" Finn gestured vaguely at the ceiling stains. Thalo found Mira in the medical bay, not because she was injured, but because the cubs had refused to let Zephyr treat a shallow cut on her arm until they were certain she wasn't in mortal danger. All 6 apex predators had somehow managed to fit themselves into a space designed for 2 patients, creating what appeared to be a living fur pile with Mira at the center. "Doctor." "Wells," Thales said, settling into the chair that Scout had thoughtfully positioned for optimal pack communication dynamics. "I believe I owe you an apology." "For what?" Mira asked, absently scratching behind the ears of whichever cub had maneuvered closest to her uninjured hand. "For assuming that emotional intelligence was a primitive trait rather than an evolutionary advantage." He paused, watching as the cubs arranged themselves for optimal defensive coverage, despite being in the safest location on the station. "Your approach to interspecies cooperation has achieved results that our standard protocols couldn't match in decades of research." Mira's smile was the kind that could power life support systems. "The funny thing is, it's not really my approach. It's theirs. I just learned to listen." Zephyr finished treating the cut and stepped back, her mandibles clicking with what passed for amazement among her species. "The neurochemical data from today's events is unprecedented. Stress hormones across all species decreased during combat rather than increased. They were calmer fighting together than they ever were in isolation." "Pack behavior," Mira explained, as Scout nuzzled closer with what appeared to be relief that she was still intact and functional. "Isolation is stress. Cooperation is safety. Most galactic species forgot that somewhere between developing faster-than-light travel and deciding that emotions were inefficient. Thales' throat sac inflated thoughtfully. The Galactic Council will want a full report on today's events. They can have one, Mira said, but they're not going to like the conclusions. Which are that trust-based interspecies cooperation isn't just more effective than containment-based research. It's the foundation for everything we thought we knew about intelligence, evolution, and survival. She gestured to the cubs, who had somehow managed to arrange themselves so that each one was touching both her and at least two of their siblings. These individuals didn't follow me because I was smarter or stronger or more advanced. They followed me because I proved I was worth following. 6 months later, the Galactic Research Station had been redesigned around principles that would have been considered impossibly naive before what historians were already calling the Mira Incident. Containment fields had been replaced with environmental habitats. Research subjects had become research partners, and at the center of it all, a small human xenobiologist continued her daily walks through what was now officially designated as the galaxy's first cooperative species preserve. The security footage still showed her followed by 6 umbral hunter cubs, but now they were joined by dozens of other species who had discovered that trust, once established, was far more valuable than any containment protocol ever devised. When new researchers asked Security Chief Finn why the creatures followed Dr. Wells with such devotion, his answer had become something of a legend among the galactic scientific community. She said, "They don't follow anyone they don't trust." Turns out, the secret isn't getting them to trust you. It's proving you're worthy of that trust in the first place. And in the preserve beyond, creatures from across the galaxy continued to demonstrate that cooperation wasn't just an evolutionary advantage. It was the foundation of civilization itself, regardless of species or point of origin. Some lessons, apparently, were universal.